You taste ash before you understand why. Not from a hearth, not from a torch. This is the bitter, oily sting of something meant to cling, meant to crawl. The night air is alive with a low animal groan as ropes tighten and timber complains under impossible strain. Somewhere beyond the dark, a shape the size of a house shifts, and the ground seems to hold its breath with you. A moment later, the sky itself feels weaponized, an arc of destruction rising, silent at first, then arriving with that sickening whistle that turns your spine into ice because you know it's already too late to move. Up on the stone, men who haven't slept properly in weeks stare at a world that has become nothing but impact, hunger, and waiting. Outside the walls, thousands treat the suffering like a spectacle. Inside, 30-something souls count cracks in the masonry, like they're counting down to the end of a life they can't imagine after this. They would call it the Siege of Stirling Castle, and in later retellings, it would become a symbol of medieval cruelty sharpened into theatre. Not just a military operation, but a performance staged in mud and smoke, where surrender could be refused, not for strategy, but for satisfaction. This standoff doesn't endure in memory because it was the biggest siege in Britain, or because the stone walls were uniquely strong. It endures because of a question that feels almost modern in its ugliness. What happens when power stops caring about the outcome and starts caring about the spectacle? The setting is Stirling Castle, the jagged crown of rock that controls the passage between lowlands and highlands, the kind of place that doesn't just sit in a landscape, it dominates it. The time is the early 1300s, when the air in Scotland is thick with betrayal, oaths, shifting loyalties, and the slow, grinding pressure of an invading empire. The ruler outside the walls is King Edward IV of England, a man whose reputation is already hardening into legend. The men inside are led by a governor named William Oliphant, outnumbered so absurdly that it should not even be called a siege, but an inevitability with a schedule. And yet, inevitability is never as clean as the people in charge want it to be. Because the strange truth of Stirling is that it did not fall quickly. It resisted long enough to embarrass a king who believed embarrassment was a kind of treason. It held long enough for machines to multiply in the fields like iron weeds. It held long enough for starvation to become routine, and routine to become a kind of quiet insanity. And it held long enough for the outside world to forget that inside those walls were men with names and hands and memories, men who still flinched when stones hit, still dreamed of bread, still listened for footsteps in corridors that were growing emptier by the day. In the beginning, it doesn't feel like history. It feels like weather. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Honestly, it's surreal that a castle's last stand can echo into living rooms all over the world. The first stones arrive the way storms do. Distant thunder, then sudden violence. A rock slams into the outer wall, and the entire castle seems to shudder, not like a building, but like a living thing struck in the ribs. Dust blossoms in the torchlight. Pebbles skitter across the courtyard. Somewhere, a man drops his cup because his hands won't stop shaking, and he hates himself for it, and then hates himself for hating himself because shame is a luxury when you're starving. Outside, the siege lines don't look like an army camp so much as a city being assembled overnight. Fires everywhere, tents in ranks, work crews moving like ants in a churned-up world of mud and timber, engineers shouting measurements, carpenters shaping beams, men hauling rope thicker than a wrist. The sound never stops. Even when the bombardment pauses to reload, the labor continues, sawing, hammering, dragging, cursing, laughing. That laughter is what breaks something inside the walls first, not the stones, not the hunger, not the fear of death, the laughter. Because when you're trapped, you start to believe the enemy must also be suffering, must also be tense, must also be praying for this to end. Stirling teaches the defenders a darker lesson. The people outside can be comfortable. They can eat, they can drink. They can treat your slow death as background noise. William Oliphant walks the battlements like a man trying to keep a ship afloat with his bare hands. He's not a mythic hero carved from marble. He's a tired governor with too few men and too many responsibilities. Every corner of this castle has to be watched. Every breach has to be patched. Every ember has to be smothered. Every man has to be convinced not to crack. And what does he have to work with? A handful of soldiers, a few knights, some servants who have become fighters because there's no one else, a cook who can no longer cook anything worth calling a meal, a clerk who writes fewer and fewer entries because ink becomes less important than survival, a priest whose prayers have started to sound hoarse as if even heaven is tired of listening. At first, Oliphant tells them relief may come, that someone will break the siege, that Scotland will not let Stirling fall. He tells them this because a leader's first duty is not always truth. Sometimes it is endurance, but the horizon stays empty. Days pass, then weeks, and the castle begins to change. Not in a dramatic collapse, more like a slow shrinking of the world. Rooms that once felt like shelter start to feel like tombs. The air grows stale. The smell of unwashed bodies becomes permanent. The sound of stone striking stone becomes the rhythm of their lives, like a heartbeat they can't escape. Food becomes arithmetic. A barrel opened means a week less. A handful of peas means someone else will go without. Bread becomes thinner, then disappears. Men begin to chew things that are not food because the mouth needs to do something other than pray. Leather straps soften in boiled water. Old scraps of hide become stew if you squint hard enough. Even when they laugh about it, the laughter tastes like panic. And then the messengers come. They arrive with flags, with voices practiced in proclamation, with offers that sound merciful when shouted across a ditch. Surrender, they say. Lives will be spared, they say. Mercy is still on the table. Oliphant listens. He doesn't spit. He doesn't scream. He doesn't make a dramatic speech for the sake of legend. He answers like a man bound to a code that is older than hunger. He says he holds the castle for his rightful lord. He says he cannot surrender without permission. He asks for time, time to send word, time to receive instruction, time to do this properly. It is, in its own way, a noble request. It is also a request that assumes the enemy still cares about rules. Outside the walls, the king hears it and does not smile. Because this siege is not being conducted by a man who merely wants territory. It is being conducted by a man who wants certainty. A man who wants submission to look clean and final, like a stamp pressed into wax. A man who cannot accept the idea that 30 starving defenders get to dictate the pace of his victory. And so the answer comes back, short and cold. No, no time, no negotiation, no dignified delay. Surrender now or suffer. This is the point where the siege changes from war into something else. The outside world begins to reorganize itself, not around taking the castle, but around crushing the idea of resistance. More machines arrive, more crews, more timber. The fields become workshops. The sky fills with the arc of stones. The earth fills with trenches. The castle begins to feel like it is being buried while still standing. And among the king's decisions, some strategic, some petty, one detail becomes a kind of stain you can't wash out. A private viewing place, a comfortable platform, a space where the royal presence can watch without discomfort. Not because watching is necessary for command, but because watching is part of the point. Picture it, fine fabric and polished wood within sight of men eating boiled leather. A cup of wine raised as a stone slams into a tower. The soft murmur of courtly conversation drifting on the same wind that carries screams. If this feels like cruelty sharpened into art, that's because it is. Inside Stirling, the defenders begin to understand that even surrender may not save them, not because the laws of war are unclear, but because the man outside is no longer obeying the logic of war. He is obeying the logic of dominance. He wants to be seen winning. He wants the world to remember how it felt to oppose him. That's when the fire begins. At first, it's just smoke, the kind that makes you cough and curse and wave your hand like an idiot because you can't wave smoke away. But then it becomes flame that behaves wrong, flame that doesn't simply burn and go out, flame that seems to grab. A clay pot shatters somewhere in the courtyard and the splash ignites like spilled hatred. The mixture crawls across wood, licking up beams and hoardings. It clings to stone as if stone is fuel. Men throw water and watch the fire flare, spreading like it's laughing at them. Someone drags a hide over it. Someone shovels sand with trembling hands. Someone beats at it with a cloak until the cloak catches, and then the man is on fire and the screaming turns into the worst sound of all. A scream that becomes a struggle for breath. Night becomes their enemy, because fire is brightest at night, and the enemy outside knows that. They can see the defenders moving by the light of the flames. They can aim at the silhouettes. They can turn firefighting into an execution. Oliphant becomes a man who lives in motion. He is everywhere. Battlements, courtyard, storeroom, chapel. His mind stretched thin by a problem too large for anyone human. He tells his men to hold. He tells them to breathe. He tells them the fire can be beaten. He tells them they are not dead yet. And because humans are stubborn in ways that are sometimes holy and sometimes tragic, they listen. They beat back the flames. They smother them. They survive, which should have ended the spectacle. In a reasonable world, endurance earns respect, and respect invites negotiation. But this is not a reasonable world. This is a world where survival is taken as an insult. Outside, the king escalates again, not with poetry, with carpentry. New siege engines appear like the ribs of giant beasts. Some are massive, slow, deliberate. Others are smaller and faster, meant for constant harassment. The rhythm becomes relentless. The castle stops having quiet. Quiet is replaced by the expectation of impact. Sleep becomes impossible. Not because the men are kept awake by fear. Fear can become familiar. But because the body cannot rest when the stone beneath it vibrates like a drum. Men start to hallucinate from exhaustion. They speak to people who aren't there. They flinch at shadows. They snap at each other over nothing. A man laughs at a joke and then suddenly starts crying. And no one asks why because everyone understands. Then comes the twist that turns cruelty into legend. A machine is built that is not merely a weapon, but a statement. A trebuchet so enormous the work of making it becomes a siege within the siege. Forests are stripped for timber. Iron is shaped and hauled. Ropes are spun thicker. Crews labor day and night. The thing rises in the mud like a cathedral built for violence. The defenders can see it growing. That is the horror. Not just that it exists, but that it takes time. And time is something the starving inside do not have. Every day the frame rises higher is a day closer to the moment it will speak. The men on the walls begin to whisper about it. They nickname it in their own way, some with fatalistic humor, some with prayers. They watch as the arm is assembled, as the counterweight box is prepared, as stones the size of calves are rolled into place like offerings. Outside, the army watches too. Even the soldiers become spectators now, not because they care about engineering, but because the machine promises an ending. A dramatic ending, the kind you can tell stories about later with your drink in hand. And that is when Oliphant finally breaks, not in spirit, but in calculation. He understands that this is no longer about holding out until relief arrives. Relief is not coming. Scotland's banners are not cresting the hills. The world beyond Stirling has moved on, surrendered, reorganized itself, survived in ways that do not include saving these men. So he does what leaders do when they can no longer justify the deaths they're commanding. He chooses surrender. The gate opens, and for a moment, it almost feels like the story will become humane. A small group emerges, thin as ghosts, faces hollow, eyes too bright from sleeplessness. They carry the posture of men who have already died once and are now performing the motions of life. They approach the enemy lines carefully, because even surrender can be misread as deception. They offer terms. They offer submission. They offer the end. The army outside begins to react. Relief, laughter, triumph. The long tension finally snapping into celebration. This is the moment a siege is supposed to end. But the king does not end it. He looks at his great machine, the monstrous trebuchet, the showpiece, the appetite made of wood and rope. and sees a victory that has been taken from him. Not stolen by the enemy, stolen by timing, by inconvenience, by the defenders choosing to quit before the final act. And something in him hardens. He refuses the surrender. Not because it's strategically wise, not because he fears trickery, not because he needs more concessions. He refuses because the machine has not fired. Imagine what that does to the men who came out. They have crossed the killing field to offer their lives and their obedience, and now they are told calmly to go back inside, to return to the place that is about to be struck, to become targets again, not for war, but for demonstration. It is one of the most chilling reversals in the entire tale, because it reveals the true standoff, not between England and Scotland, not between a king and a castle, but between human life and a ruler's vanity. The envoys return to the gate slowly. There is no speech, no dramatic protest. Just the silent, stunned movement of men who have realized they are trapped in someone else's story. They go back into the castle and close the gate behind them, and the sound of that gate closing feels like a coffin lid. Inside, Oliphant faces his men. How do you explain this? How do you tell starving soldiers that surrender was rejected because the enemy wants to test a machine? How do you keep them from collapsing into rage or despair or madness? You don't. Not really. You just wait. Outside, the crews assemble. The ropes are checked. The sling is fitted. The counterweight is loaded until the frame looks like it's bending under the idea of what it's about to do. Men take their positions at the winches. The mechanism groans as the arm is drawn down, tension rising like the inhale before a scream. The valley grows quiet in the way crowds go quiet before a spectacle. Because make no mistake, this is a crowd now. Thousands of eyes fixed on the machine. Soldiers, engineers, nobles, clerks, servants, and somewhere, the sheltered royal presence, watching from comfort. The trigger is released. The counterweight drops with the certainty of gravity's cruelty. The arm whips upward with violent elegance. The stone leaves the sling and becomes a blur, a streak of fate cutting through air. Inside Stirling, the defenders do not see it coming. They only hear it. First the whoosh, then the impact that makes the world buckle. Stone explodes into dust. Masonry cracks like bone. A section of wall or gatehouse, whatever the aim, ceases to be a structure and becomes debris. The shock travels through the castle's foundations and into the bodies of the men inside. Some are knocked off their feet. Some scream. Some go silent because silence is all their minds can produce now. A cloud rises. Powdered stone hanging in the air like the ghost of the wall that used to be there. One shot. That's the cruelest part. One shot to prove a point that could have been conceded without it. Outside, the king watches the dust settle. The experiment has succeeded. The machine works. The performance lands. Only then does mercy return. Not as mercy, but as permission. Now they may surrender. And what follows is not an end, but a ritual. The surviving defenders are made to come out in humiliation. Weapons surrendered. Armor stripped. The posture of men reduced to pleading. Rope imagery, dust, submission. Symbols layered on symbols, as if conquest is not complete until the conquered are forced to participate in their own erasure. Oliphant, the man who held too long for a king who didn't deserve the drama, is taken away. Not executed, because execution would be too clean, too honorable in its finality. Instead, imprisonment. A living trophy, locked far from the rock he defended, kept as proof that resistance ends in chains. The castle is claimed. The camp dismantles. The siege engines that once seemed like gods sunk into the mud become timber again. Fires fade. Men fold tents. Clerks roll parchment. The field returns to being a field, but changed, the way any place touched by violence feels wrong long after the grass grows back. Yet the strangest legacy of the Siege of Stirling Castle is not the wall that fell or the machine that fired it. It is what the story reveals about power. Edward's cruelty, his hunger for spectacle, his refusal of surrender, did not create stability. It created memory. It created resentment with a heartbeat. It taught a lesson whispered in taverns and farmhouses. If surrender is treated as inconvenience, what faith is left in obedience? In the years that follow, names change. Banners change. Strategies evolve, but the emotion remains. A nation is not a wall, and breaking stone does not break spirit. Records survive. Lists of timber, rope, wages paid. Cold administrative pages that read like routine, until you remember each item is suffering turned into logistics. The cruelty is not only in the screaming, but in the calm paperwork that made it possible. The story ends not with peace, but with quiet. Dust settles, men ride away. And on the hill a castle breathes dust, a king is satisfied, and 30 men, too small for an empire, force history to remember them anyway.